Hi there, it's Geoff here. Welcome to an economics policy in action video. Let's take a look at something that's really topical at the moment, both in the UK and overseas, and that's the economics of tourist taxes. Tourist tax, also known as a transient visitor levy, becoming increasingly popular both in major towns and cities in different countries, and also countries looking to manage the effects of tourism. Tourism is clearly a key industry, generates huge amounts of foreign currency, creates jobs, but there are economic and external costs and benefits to consider. So a tourist tax is typically charged per night of accommodation or per entry, with funds often hypothecated or earmarked for improving infrastructure, protecting cultural heritage, protecting sacred sites, for example, and addressing environmental consequences of tourism. And clearly, this is a really interesting economics idea. It has its merits, it has its arguments for, its justifications, but it's not without controversy. Here are a few examples of tourist taxes at the moment. Bhutan, I think, at the time of recording this video, has the highest tourist tax in the world. It's called a sustainable development fee. It's a great example to have to your notes. And it's designed, according to the Bhutan government, to achieve a high-value, low-impact tourism model. And the charge is $100 per day. Venice has brought in a €5 charge for day trippers. It's a higher fee, double the charge actually for non-reservation visitors. And again, you can imagine Venice as an area that has been deeply affected by growing numbers of tourists, in particular from cruise ships. And Prague, Czech Republic, tourist charge is not as much, it's €2 per night. It's been brought in, obviously an incredibly popular city within the European Union. That charge, by the way, excludes children under 18 and also any stay longer than 60 days. So it's clearly earmarked and targeted at the short stay, including the stag weekends. And here's a quick table, if you want to take a screenshot for your notes, showing some examples of cities that have or are anticipating bringing in a tourist tax. From Barcelona to Venice, as we mentioned. Edinburgh in Scotland has launched or is about to vote on a 5% visitor levy. And that's designed to be launched in the spring of 2026. And examples there from Bali, from Bhutan, as we mentioned, and also from Amsterdam in Holland, $3 per person per night. Keep in mind, oftentimes these tourist taxes are in conjunction with other interventions. So, for example, in Amsterdam, cruise ship docking restrictions also implemented. Likewise, I think, in Venice. So what are the arguments for a tourist tax? Well, the economic case is essentially that it generates money, it generates revenue. And Barcelona, for example, which charges up to €6.75 per night for five-star hotel guests, they earmark or they hypothecate the funds. In other words, they allocate the funds to improve public transport, for street cleaning and maintaining landmarks. And the levy generated over €1 million a week in 2022. And so for some local authorities, that extra revenue is needed, but it could also be a way of maybe holding down the increase in local taxes for local people. I think the main economic argument is probably to do with externalities, the negative externalities of consumption and production from over-tourism. I think Venice will be the example you might choose there. 30 million annual visitors, clearly huge pressure on the built environment. And taxes are designed as an incentive, a deterrent for excessive footfall, particularly in fragile ecosystems. One thinks of Bhutan and Bali there, or overburdened urban centres. And Bali brought in a $10 levy to address specifically the pollution and the damage caused by tourism. So revenue generation, externalities, and also issues of social equity. Often these areas of high tourist footfall drive up housing costs. So, for example, people making their properties available for Airbnb makes it less likely that local people, particularly younger folk, can afford to get their foot on the housing ladder. And clearly tourism strains local resources, creates extra pollution and can displace residents as well. Florence's ban on Airbnb is a good example, reflecting the push to prioritise residents' quality of life. And other cities are thinking about introducing similar bans. But what about the evaluation? Well, what are the downsides? Clearly, there are always risks with these kind of taxes. One is the impact on the tourist sector. So a tax might deter price-sensitive, budget-conscious travellers, travellers with a high price elasticity of demand, or it could simply divert tourists to destinations that don't have such taxes. Now, in my local city, York, they're thinking about bringing in a new tourist tax. I was in York yesterday walking around, and even in January, it's fairly busy. Mind you, it costs 20 quid to walk into the cathedral, so they're making their money there. York's hospitality industry, which is very big in that city, have expressed concerns that the proposed tax could make the city less attractive, less competitive, especially at a time when costs for hotels, for example, are going up. The minimum wage is increasing to £12.20 an hour, and of course hotels suffering from increased national insurance costs and the soaring cost of energy. The second consequence is the disproportionate impact on low-income tourists. Let's think about Kyoto in Japan. They're proposing a £52 per night, adjusting for the exchange rate, tax by 2026. And again, that disproportionately hits budget travellers, gap year travellers, for example, families trying to travel on a restricted budget. It has relatively low impact on wealthier visitors who are staying in luxury accommodation. So you could make a case for saying that, let's say, a €10 per night tax is regressive because it tends to hit lower income tourists and families and groups, for example, student groups from schools and things, rather than people who are on, wealthy retired pensioners, for example, living off generous pensions, who can basically pay the tax regardless. And the other really important point, I think this is the uncertainty which is worth putting into any evaluation if you get a question on these kind of things, is it's not always clear where the revenue is going to go. We think the money is going to be raised to spend on protecting monuments, improving public transport, so on and so forth. But a key criticism is the lack of transparency or openness in how funds are spent. So in York and Liverpool, again, two cities in the north of England thinking about these taxes, one of the concerns expressed by people is whether the money will simply go into the big pot of city budgets, or whether it will genuinely have a beneficial impact on the daily lives of residents and perhaps tourists alike. We need to know how the money, well, two things. One, how much money is it going to raise? And secondly, how is that money used? So tourist taxes, worth knowing about. It's really interesting. It's both micro and macro, really. Very interesting that many cities around the world are now thinking about or have tried or introduced tourist taxes. So this is a really good example of government intervention and action, often at local level, local councils. Think about the micro and macro consequences. Hey, thanks for joining in. Take care. Stay safe. Stay curious. Stay healthy. See you sometime soon.